right, I've just been told I can start. Hello, my name's Guy Sartorelli. I'm the Senior Product Developer at Stripe. You might recognize me from this image on Slack and GitHub and the like. Apologies in advance, I'm going to be talking very quickly to try and get through as much of this as I can. I've actually got more content than I have time to go through. But basically the purpose of this talk is to show you how easy and valuable it is to provide a preview for, apparently some of that was skipped. I'll just start again. Sorry about that. I'm Guy Sartorelli. I'm a senior product developer at Stripe. You might recognize me from this profile image on GitHub and Slack and the like. I'm going to be talking very quickly to try and get through as much of my content as I can, because I actually have more than I have time allotted. But basically, I'm going to be trying to convince you that it's both valuable and easy to provide a preview for basically any content in the CMS. So if your data has any visual representation and you're using Stripe 4.11, you should be giving a preview in the CMS. So my whole talk is actually going to be in the preview panel. Out of the box, you'll obviously get your preview for pages. That's what you're used to. That's pre-4.11. But as of 4.11, you also have a preview for any elemental blocks. And you can also now create a preview for any data object in a subclass of left and main, theoretically. It's only really been tested in model admin, but theoretically any subclass of left and main. So here's an example of a user form that, as I mentioned, it's not inline editable, so it opens up as a separate form. And you don't even have to do anything to implement this one. You just, as soon as you update to 4.11, you will have a preview of your elemental blocks, of any elemental block that is not inline editable. So for example, I can go ahead and add a new field, and we will see it pop up in the preview. What you don't get out of the box is, for example, each field is a separate data object, and these data objects are not previewable out of the box. So if I have time towards the end, I'll kind of talk about how you can get around that for things like this that are in a module that are not your own code. Yeah, just be aware that just because it's in an elemental block doesn't mean that you necessarily get a preview of it if it's a separate data object. Okay, so what happens if you follow the documentation? So you're actually implementing your own data objects now. Well, the documentation will show you first off how to deal with objects that have a has-one relation with a page. So in this case, I've got a couple of books here. They're in a grid field. It has many from the page to that data object, and the data object has a has-one from the object to the page. And as you can see, those are previewable. I'll show you the code for that in a second, but for now, just be aware that the documentation shows you exactly how to do that. The next thing the documentation shows you, and I need to go to a model admin for this, is how to preview records that are displayed in a model admin. So this is your bread and butter, basically. Anything on a page or in a model admin is very, very easy to get previewed. And here we can see the start content here is being previewed. So let's look at the documentation. The most important parts are that your data object must implement CMS previewable. You also need to have one of these. It's if you don't use the versioned extension, then it's this show unversioned preview link. And if it is versioned, then there's a draft and a live equivalent for that. And the next important thing is to have a preview link method. That's part of the CMS previewable interface, and that will tell the preview panel exactly what content it should be showing. So for this example, this was the model admin. So it's just going, give me a singleton of my model admin, give me a link to that model admin for this class, and then it's got a action on the model admin that is defined. So it's just calling a link, creating a link for that action on the model admin. And then if we look at the model admin, here's that action that was being called. this is all just boilerplate to basically say call for template on the object. So that's going to render out the template that is defined for that object and then return whatever the result is of that rendered content. And then if we look at the documentation for the page, it's largely the same. So we're implementing CMS previewable. In this case, it's versioned. So we're showing the stage or draft and the live or published. And then if we go down to preview link, it's just saying, give me the page from my has1 relation, call link on the page. And in this case, it's also adding an anchor. And that just means that when you preview the information in the preview panel, it will scroll down if it's further down on the page so that you're viewing actually the content that's in the edit form. You don't have to scroll down in the preview to find it. So that's what you get by following the documentation. Obviously, the documentation isn't going to cover every possible scenario. So I've thought of a couple of things that are kind of more advanced that maybe you might have going on in your own projects. So in this case, it looks very similar to the previous example. It's an object that is being managed in a model admin, but this also has a many relation with a page. So it could be previewed not only here in the model admin, but in any arbitrary page that you happen to have that many relation. If I just remember which of the pages it is. So here's that in the grid field, and if I click on it, it's being previewed now. Here it is, that same content. It's being previewed in the context now of the page, whereas before it was previewed the same model in the context of a model admin. And really the only difference is what you're doing in your model itself. So it's just in this preview link method, and it's very similar to what's documented. But in this case, we're saying if the current controller is an instance of CMS main, so that's your pages section, then get me a preview link for the page. And that looks like this. It's the exact same as the documentation, except we're getting the page not from the relation, but this time from the controller itself. Because remember, it's a many relation in this instance. So it could be literally any page. So we need to make sure we get the current page from the controller. And then if the current controller is not CMS main, so it's anywhere else literally in the CMS, we're just going to get a different preview. And that's, again, the same documented way for the model admin. This is my model admin. Give me a link for this class. And then the CMS preview action is identical to the one in the documentation. So that's all very good and well. That's how you deal with HTML content. What about PDFs? You will be happy to know you can display a PDF directly in the preview panel. So this isn't HTML anymore. This is actually a literal PDF, which is being generated on the fly. In this case, I'm using WK-HTML to PDF to turn the HTML markup into a PDF. But however you want to do that, that's up to you. That's beyond this demo. The point is that it's very easy to do. So if we look, I've made this into a trait just to make it clear what's going on. The preview link, it's identical again to the documented method for getting a model admin preview. If we look at the admin, it's basically identical again. The only difference is instead of calling for template and then returning the HTML markup, we're calling a method on our data object. I've just called it send to browser because it is literally sending the PDF to the browser. And on the PDF, the send to browser, first we prepare the PDF, which is just creating the PDF content itself from the HTML. And then I'm using an extraction layer. There's a library that I'm using. You can look it up on GitHub later. But it's just calling a send method on that library. So you don't even have to implement that part yourself. You just call the method, and then you've got your preview. But there is more. Say that you can't remember which of these is the PDF that you're specifically interested in. You can just preview it directly from the grid field. We're not even looking at a specific record in the form here. This is the model admin grid field itself. And I've created a method, a module, bit of a self plug here. You don't have to implement anything at all except for the data object. And then if you install this module, you will get these nice little grid field buttons. The last little trick up my sleeve. In this case, if I go preview, you'll see no preview available. The preview link method for this object is actually just returning a blank string. But you might notice this little select option down here. That will let me select either of these PDFs, which are in many relation, and display those instead of the content of the actual record. So this is controlling the preview panel through JavaScript instead of through the normal PHP stuff. There are some limitations to this that I don't have time to go into. Hit me up on Slack if you're interested. But just showing that there are a lot of ways that you can use the preview panel in your own projects. Finally, I'd just like to go over a couple of limitations that we have in the current implementation. Silverstripe CMS has to be installed, is one of the big ones. So you can't just install Silverstripe admin, you need CMS as well. That's a limitation that we're hoping to get rid of in CMS 5. I've got a pull request open for that. I'm just waiting for it to get merged. There's no clean way to make a model from a vendor module previewable. So if you have some third-party module and you want one of their data objects to be previewable, currently you can't do that. You'd have to subclass the data object and then make your subclass previewable and then use the injector to replace it, and that's a bit of a mess. So I've got a pull request to make it so that you can have an extension applied instead. Again, I'm waiting to have that reviewed and merged, but that won't be in CMS 4. There's some API breaks that are required for that. And then the last thing, I know I showed you some fancy JavaScript stuff towards the end there, but the API for that isn't actually very well defined. It requires you to use some underscore prefix stuff that looks like it's supposed to be private, and it's not very well documented. So there's definitely some work to be done in that space. So you can do stuff with JavaScript, but it's a bit more of a pain than all of the other stuff that I showed you. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time. That's all I had to show.
Guy, really good stuff. Interesting to see that this is evolving. Any questions from the audience regarding this? Nothing. Nothing. Well, you were very thorough, I guess, with everything. So thank you for that, and have a good night. Thank you.
Thanks.